Joint practices are about to kick off for the New Orleans Saints and Los Angeles Chargers, and there are some marquee matchups to watch along the way. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome in to another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, to all you everydayers out there making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget, you can always subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episodes. And as always, if you want to keep the conversation going one-on-one with me, take part in our exclusive film studies, Q&As, inside information, early access, and much more, you can head over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints to join a community I would love for you to be a part of. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on your favorite social media, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media. You can find me every day as the senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site covering the New Orleans Saints, every Tuesday on the Locked On NFL podcast, and here with you every single Monday through Friday, and then some on Locked On Saints. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, by the time that you're watching or listening to this, I am probably in the air on my way to sunny California, although it's not going to be as sunny there as it has been here in New Orleans, and we're grateful for that for a moment. A little bit of respite from the heat. We're going to be getting ready for joint practices between the Saints and the Chargers. So today we're going to explain why joint practices are important. We're going to take a look at how the first team offensive line performed against the Kansas City Chiefs. Don't want to move too much further without going through that. But first off, I want to take a look at some of the big time matchups that are coming up in these joint practices between the Saints and the Chiefs. Let's start off there. So look, this is an awesome opportunity for a lot of players to be able to get their chance to go up against unfamiliar opponents in a very controlled environment. We're going to break down what that means later, but let's take a look at how the iron sharpens iron approach that the New Orleans Saints have taken to their entire training camp so far this offseason ends up being impacted and really carried on in these joint practices against the Los Angeles Chargers. Listen to some of the opportunities that the New Orleans Saints are going to have in terms of their matchups. Of course, we're going to start at the most important position in the NFL. We'll start off with the quarterback, and this kind of goes both ways. We'll start with Derek Carr, though. Derek Carr going up against this Los Angeles Chargers defense. While the New Orleans Saints defense was number 2 against the pass last year, the Los Angeles Chargers were not far behind at number 7, the 7th ranked passing defense last year, the Chargers. And now you've got Derek Carr, who's familiar with that very same defense. He played against them twice last year when he was a Raider, or at least was on the schedule to go up against him twice last year when he was a Raider. And so you get an opportunity to really test Derek Carr against a still very good defense, but maybe not one that, at least last year, finished as good as the New Orleans Saints one that he's been facing all offseason long. And look, we've watched the New Orleans Saints defense dominate in some of these practices. What will be the case against the Los Angeles Chargers? Of course, there's some turnover when it comes to changes for both of these teams. There's a lot of turnover in terms of who Derek Carr is now throwing the football to and what the rest of his offense looks like as he's on a brand new team. But of course, the Chargers have made some investments on the defensive side of the ball that will hopefully, for them, help them continue to boost up. We'll get to some of those in just a sec. But the Saints defense will also get its own test. Does that number 2 ranked defense, with the mass exodus they had on the defensive line and all of those new defensive line players that they brought in, does that defense hold up against a Justin Herbert, or who, as I will refer to him for the rest of this episode, Justin Herbert, the way that they have held up against somebody that they're familiar going up against, like a Derek Carr, a Jameis Winston, and at times a Jake Haener. So you'll get the measure by each quarterback. So you get the measure for Derek Carr up against a solid defense, and you get the measure of a solid defense up against a good quarterback like Justin Herbert. Herbert, not Herbert. I'm saying Herbert today. Let's take a look at some parts of that defense over in Los Angeles that will give the New Orleans Saints an opportunity to kind of have a measuring stick or a barometer to see how far their offense has come. While the New Orleans Saints are going to line up pass catchers like Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, and Juwan Johnson, the pair of wide receivers at the top. Of course, their top tight end, along with Foster Moreau, another top tight end, Taysom Hill, who did leave practice early on Tuesday with a strained oblique. We'll see if he participates, but either way, the Saints are going to have a lot of pass catchers out there going up against some very formidable, very good defensive backs, including, but not limited to, for the Chargers, J.C. Jackson, who was outstanding. Asante Samuel Jr., who was one of those guys that like a lot of people overlook because he's an undersized corner, but he plays with a ferocity that is just incredible and that you can't deny. And of course, Derwin James, one of the best safeties in the NFL, a guy that NFL coaches, executives, so on and so forth, just ranked as the number 2 safety in the NFL this offseason. So you're going to get a real opportunity to see the New Orleans Saints pass catchers go up against a formidable opponent in that Kansas City, in that Los Angeles Chargers secondary. It doesn't stop there. You get back versus back as well. You got the running backs for the New Orleans Saints, Alvin Kamara. Yes, he's suspended for the first 3 games, but he's still able to participate in training camp, including these joint practices, as well as, of course, preseason games. So we're going to see him go up against a former draft darling of a lot of New Orleans Saints fans in Kenneth Murray. So now you're going to get an opportunity to see how does Alvin Kamara look against unfamiliar and talented opponents. The Kansas City Chiefs gave you a little bit of that barometer last week with Willie Gay, another guy that was, a star rookie, prospect coming into the NFL, just like Kenneth Murray has been or was, and has been a solid NFL player since coming in. Now you get to see him against Alvin Kamara. You get to see Jamal Williams against him. You can see Darrell Williams against him, the new signee for the New Orleans Saints, and potentially Kendre Miller, depending upon how positive that diagnosis in the medical news has been. Then we flip it over to the New Orleans Saints defense. The Saints defense and their secondary, including, of course, cornerbacks like Marshon, Lattimore, Paulson, Adebo, and Alante Taylor, are going to be put to the test against very good talent like Keenan Allen, as well as Mike Williams, who have been doing it for a long time and have been successful. And then now, of course, they added in rookie wide receiver Quentin Johnston from TCU, also a guy that is big, that's physical, that matches the brand of a Keenan Allen, that matches the brand of a Mike Williams, and being able to go against these physical corners, Marshon Lattimore, Paulson Adebo, and Alante Taylor. So you're going to get to see those matchups as well. And then finally, the pass rushers for that defense, Joey Bosa, as well as Khalil Herbert. See what I did there? Khalil Mack, going up against Trevor Penning and Ryan Ramczyk. And I think Trevor Penning is the big time evaluation there. Joey Bosa took more than 60% of his snaps, I believe it was, over on what would be the right side of the offensive line. So more times than not, he would be lining up across from Ryan Ramczyk. But a guy like Khalil Mack played about 49-51 in terms of percentages on either side. It was very evenly split. So both of those players are going to go up against both of those players. And a guy like Trevor Penning, who you want to get all the reps and looked good. We're actually going to get to his performance in the preseason game here in just a second. Looked really good during the preseason. What does he look like in these joint practices as well as in the preseason game? Because you can expect Trevor Penning to continue to get opportunities and get reps during the preseason. So whether you're looking at the quarterback, whether you're looking at the Saints offensive line, whether you're looking at the Saints defensive line, their wide receivers, pass catchers, defensive backs, whatever it is that you're looking at for the New Orleans Saints, the Chargers have talented players that match up immediately with those players. So you're going to get a really good understanding and idea of where your New Orleans Saints are throughout these joint practices. We'll highlight a little bit more about why this is important later. But next, I want to not get too far away from Trevor Penning without really discussing Trevor Penning as well as the rest of the offensive line. How did they perform in their first preseason game? Remarkably well. Let me give you the numbers behind it next. Got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends at Nutrafol. Did you know that over 80% of men are going to experience hair thinning in their lifetime? Take it from me, the Chrome Dome. You want to act on it fast, and you can get ahead of all of that thinning with Nutrafol. You can take a hair health wellness quiz. It's going to identify the source and causes behind all of that thinning, and then give you a personalized plan to reach better hair health through whole body wellness. Take your first step to visibly thicker, healthier hair. For a limited time, Nutrafol is offering our listeners $10 off of your first month subscription when shopping, as well as free shipping, when you go to Nutrafol.com/men and enter the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. Find out why over 4,000 healthcare professionals recommend Nutrafol for healthier hair. Nutrafol.com/men. Spelled Nutrafol. Nutrafol.com/men, and then enter that promo code locked on NFL. That's Nutrafol.com/men, promo code locked on NFL. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Thanks as always for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day for all you everydayers out there. Just so that you know, this is the morning episode for Wednesday, August 16th. There will not be a second episode today. We're not doing a two-a-day today because there's no Saints practice, and I'm traveling to the West Coast, to the best coast, to get ready for joint practices. There will be another episode Thursday morning, followed, of course, by a live episode from the hotel after Chargers practice, after Saints and Chargers practice with their joint practices on Thursday. Same thing for Friday. And then I'm coming back home on Saturday. We're going to do a live Bleacher Report stream immediately after the game, after the preseason game on Sunday. And then I'm coming right back over to Locked On Saints to do another live show with you. So you got a lot of Ross Jackson, a lot of Locked On Saints content on the way here over the course of the week, and what will be a busy week with these joint practices. Before we fully turn our attention to joint practices, I do want to redirect for just a moment to go over the New Orleans Saints offensive line. I do think that this is important, especially as we set up for the Los Angeles Chargers game, because again, or really not even the game, but the practices. Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa, you've got really good pass rushers over there. What are you looking at from the New Orleans Saints coming out of their game against the Kansas City Chiefs and then going into these joint practices against Los Angeles Chargers? So I want to highlight the raw numbers around the pass protection for the New Orleans Saints offensive line, looking at their starting offensive line only, just the first team. That includes Trevor Penning at left tackle. And then, of course, you're going from left tackle all the way over to right tackle. Trevor Penning, James Hurst, Eric McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, and then, of course, Ryan Ramczyk. Now, remember, Cesar Ruiz did leave practice early on Tuesday. He left practice early with a shoulder injury. It's not expected to be serious, so we'll see if he's available going up into these joint practices against the Chargers, but nonetheless, I want to look at it anyway. The five of those players combined, the entire starting unit played 8 snaps together, or eight pass blocking snaps together, 8 pass blocking snaps together, and then Trevor Penning would go on to play an additional 4 pass blocking snaps in the following drive. They gave Trevor Penning an extra drive, some more time. You're probably going to see that throughout. Even this week and against the Chargers, if the entire offensive line does not start, expect Trevor Penning to do so, not because they feel like Trevor Penning is behind the 8 ball or anything like that. It's just, well, he is. I mean, let's be real. He is behind the 8 ball, but I don't mean behind the 8 ball in terms of development. I mean behind the 8 ball in terms of experience. He missed 12 plus games last year. And I say plus because in some of the games that he appeared, he only appeared as a 6th offensive lineman, not as a left tackle, right? So there's a lot of the things that you want to look at in terms of seeing Trevor Penning's development. If you want to see that, then you have to see it by giving him the reps. So amongst those 12 snaps for Trevor Penning, as well as the 8 snaps for Eric McCoy, Cesar Ruiz, and so on, the combined offensive line for the New Orleans Saints, starting offensive line for the New Orleans Saints, gave up one single pressure. Just one. And it was Cesar Ruiz. Cesar Ruiz gave up one pressure. Wasn't a hit. It was not a sack. So it was a near perfect day in pass blocking for the New Orleans Saints offensive line, according to Pro Football Focus's charting. And that actually backs up my own just by looking back. And we did the film study, which again is available on Subtext. If you haven't done it yet, join subtext.com/LockedOnSaints to get all the film study stuff with like actual game footage and game film and stuff like that. Stuff I can't do on the YouTube page here. And so you have every reason to think like, okay, that's a good start, right? Like that's a good start. So now does that translate over to the game that they're about to play against Los Angeles, or not just the game that they're about to play against Los Angeles Chargers, but the joint practices as well? I thought that the offensive line played really, really well. And I think that this is evident. And I think the best play to kind of illustrate how well there's two plays that illustrate just how good this New Orleans Saints offensive line was in that first preseason game. The first of which was the run block setup for Alvin Kamara as he ran through, and he had the lead blocker of Adam Prentice, and everybody had a hat on a hat, and it was just a beautifully blocked kind of like knife run that went through the right side there at the A B gap. That was one. The other one was the touchdown pass, right? The touchdown pass is a pass blocking one. That's one to where you just saw that offensive line really hold up and by the time, because the way that route for Keith Kirkwood broke over the back of the end zone, you needed time for that to develop and for the throwing lane to open and all these other things. And it worked to perfection and all the way down to the touchdown. Another one actually was when the right side of the offensive line, this is where Cesar Ruiz allowed his pressure, did kind of give up a pressure. You had James Hurst and Trevor Penning and Eric McCoy absolutely locked down the left side of the line, which gave Derek Carr the opportunity to be able to step up and hit a Juwan Johnson in stride as he crossed the field. So there's several examples of the New Orleans Saints offensive line being really, really good. And even in the one example where a pressure was given up, you could see where 3/5 of the offensive line holding up or 4/5 of the offensive line holding up gives Derek Carr the opportunity to be able to do what he does best, which is be mobile in the pocket, extend plays, things like that. Now they're going to have a test here in these joint practices against the Chargers, as I mentioned several times already. Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, but if the New Orleans Saints are able to find success here against the Chargers, rep after rep after rep after rep in a practice environment, then that should translate well and at least bolster the confidence further of the New Orleans Saints offensive line. Now, if Cesar Ruiz can't participate with the shoulder injury, then we're watching, right? Because then you start getting to like Calvin Throckmorton there. Maybe you have Nick Saldiveri there, who had a fantastic block in team drills, second team drills on Tuesday in practice. Nick Saldiveri has continued to impress and show a little bit more over the course of his time. He did give up 2 pressures according to Pro Football Focus in their charting. I charted it as 1, but whatever. It was 2 hurries. They weren't hits or anything like that. Calvin Throckmorton gave up one sack. The other 2 sacks, Pro Football Focus credited not to the offensive line, but basically to Jameis Winston, saying that he held onto the ball too long. Basically, whatever. I didn't look too far into that. If it was the first team offense, then it'd be a different thing. Yes, I would have looked. But when it came to Calvin Throckmorton here, you can see that he was the one that gave up, the only player that's credited with giving up a sack in protection. So the Saints gave up just 11 pressures in total across the entire game that they played in the preseason. That included getting down to third, in some cases even further down the position than that, the 4th option, so on and so forth, when it came to that offensive line with certain units. So that's how they performed. But the biggest takeaway here is that the first team offensive line performed extremely well last week in that preseason game. And now with these joint practices, you're going to get the opportunity to show that wasn't just a fluke and that wasn't just one solid game, that they can actually repeat that against really, really solid and really, really good proven pass rushing talent. So that's what we're going to be watching over the course of joint practices. So why are these joint practices so important? Why are teams now doing more of them? We're seeing several teams across the NFL doing 2 sets of these, New Orleans Saints included. Let's explain and break that down as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a quick look at why joint practices work. Why are they so important? Why are teams doubling up now on joint practices? Well, I've got 3 things that I think that we can kind of look at here. The first of which is just like, why do they work? These joint practices work because they give you the same level of intensity, the same level of competition as any preseason game will, but with more opportunities and reps for your starters in a very controlled environment. And so when I say a controlled environment, what do I mean? When I say controlled environment, what I'm actually talking about is you have a lot more, or you're leaving a lot less up to chance. That's kind of where I'm getting at. When you're in those preseason games and then you have young players that are vying for roster spots and trying to prove themselves, you get moments like what you saw against the Kansas City Chiefs, where a defensive lineman just decided to people's elbow from the top rope and land right on Kendre Miller's knee. You can kind of eliminate those types of concerns during a joint practice. Yeah, you're going to still have some young players that are out there, but it's no contact, no one's tackling. You're not leaving anything up to chance. You're not leaving as much up to chance, I should say. There's still a chance that somebody gets hurt, of course. There's still a chance that somebody lands on somebody the wrong way, or that you get rolled up on, things like that. Like, it's football, right? Like, that's you're walking outside, you're in danger. If you're a football player, like it's that simple. And so, but I do think that you get a better opportunity to be able to control some of that stuff, and you get to go starters versus starters for the most part, as opposed to some starter that you're trying to get an extra look at, additional opportunities for, and he's going up against an undrafted guy that's at the very, very bottom of the roster and is trying to show what he can do beyond being a special teamer, and goes out there with his hair on fire and ends up potentially hurting somebody. Like, these are things, and that's not, and look, there's nothing wrong with that player. That player is not doing anything incorrect outside of maybe the people's elbow thing. That might have been a little much. I call it the people's elbow. It wasn't actually people's elbow, but he literally just like took lift off and then landed on Kendre Miller's right knee. And so, but what I do think that it does is that it gives you the opportunity to avoid moments like that, because no one's doing that in practice. No one's going to leave their feet and see who they land on in practice when you can barely play two-hand touch in practice, thanks to the NFL's CBA. And it's working. It's working. So I think that that's the one thing, right? You have a little bit more control over fueling competition. The other thing is the competition itself, which is unfamiliar. I was going to say foreign. It's not foreign, but it's unfamiliar. You don't have Ryan Ramczyk going up against Cam Jordan for the 83rd time in a week, where Cam Jordan's using this pass rush move and Ryan Ramczyk is using this pass set or whatever, right? Instead, you're going up against the Joey Bosa's of the world, who are going to give you something a little different, who's a different style of rusher. You're going against the outside linebackers, going up against sort of the stand-up edge rushers that you don't always get to see in practice here in New Orleans. Not in that context as being like the outside linebacker out of a 3-4 type of approach. I think that that's really valuable too. And you go up against a new scheme. You're not just practicing against your team scheme over and over again. You're going up against a wide zone offense, which is prevalent across the NFL right now. And that's what you're going to get when you go up against Brandon Staley and the Los Angeles Chargers, right? And of course, they've changed over things with their offensive coordinator, all this other stuff. So I think that that's the other thing that I really enjoy about the joint practices. And we saw this last year with the Green Bay Packers. You got to go up against Aaron Rodgers. You got to go up against that wide zone Mike LaFleur, Kyle Shanahan coaching tree, Sean McVay coaching tree, in Brandon Staley's case, type of offense. And I think that's a value. You're seeing something that is rolled out all across the NFL at this point, but that you're not seeing on a daily basis if you're the New Orleans Saints defense, because that's not the system, the wide zone system. That's not what they run in New Orleans. They run elements of it, but they run a West Coast Air Coryell blend of offense with some wide zone, specifically in the run game, types of concepts, outside zone, read steps, block the gap, not the player, these types of things. So I think getting to see the unfamiliar, not only in the individual player, but the unfamiliar in the scheme, helps to get your team ready for the season. And it'll happen all over again when they travel, or not when they travel, but when we all come back home here to New Orleans and the Houston Texans come to town, and you get to see something entirely different. And you get to see a defensively coached team 2 weeks in a row working with that head coach and Brandon Staley, and then of course with DeMeco Ryans, but you get to see an entirely different offense between the two. So I think that that's a value. The third thing is that you have one fewer preseason game now. And so what we're seeing now is that instead of the fourth preseason game, the last preseason game being the game that the starters get the most playing time, right? Getting them ready for the next week, which would be the regular season. What we're seeing now is that the starters are playing in the first game of the preseason. And they're kind of taking it easy game 2, taking it easy game 3. And then so now you get these opportunities here to where you get these joint practices for 4 days, right? 2 days with the Chargers, Thursday, Friday, and then 2 days with the Texans, Thursday, Friday after that. By the way, one of those practices with the Texans is expected to be in the Superdome, according to Dennis Allen, or they're hoping that it'll be in the Superdome. So then you get 4 days worth of work against the unfamiliar scheme, against the unfamiliar opponents, the individuals, right? And you get a real opportunity to see that in a controlled environment where you don't have to worry about tackling, where everyone comes together and says, okay, we're running these simulations together and we're working on all of this stuff. So I do think that that's a big benefit when it comes to, or those are the big benefits when it comes to these joint practices. Getting an opportunity to see unfamiliar opponents, both in individual and scheme, being able to have control over it as a coaching staff and as a pair of coaching staffs that come together and agree this is what is happening. This is what we're doing. And then the third thing being that you don't have the preseason game. So this gives you a real opportunity to continue to get a deeper look at starters beyond that first preseason game. It's not first preseason game, first drive, and then you put them on ice for the rest of the offseason. No. You get actual competition here, but in a controlled way where you have a lesser risk of injury. There's always going to be a risk of injury. We saw that last year in Green Bay. Remember, there was like 3 offensive linemen got hurt in one day for the New Orleans Saints against Green Bay. But that was also the week that like Marshon Lattimore made wild strides and Chris Olave made wild strides, and we got to really see Michael Thomas up against unfamiliar opponents. We got to see Caden Ellis start to pop off out of nowhere, or not out of nowhere, but really start to pop off. We saw Ryan Ramczyk and went, oh yeah, he does look good. Right. So you got to see all those little things. So yeah, you had the negative stuff that happened, which every practice has positives. Every practice has negatives. Every joint practice has positives. Every joint practice has negatives. But you also got to learn all this other stuff because you could use the barometer of a different team. And I think that that's where that measuring stick becomes really important for you. So that's why I think that joint practices work and why I think they're important and why I'm glad the New Orleans Saints are doing 2 sets of them this offseason. And hope that they do 2 sets of them again next offseason and like forever moving forward because it's cool. And it's great to be able to travel a little bit during the preseason too. Not going to lie. It's helpful. All right, y'all. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to do another preview of some of these matchups. What do you want to see from the New Orleans Saints in these matchups? What are you waiting to learn? And of course, what are some of the young guys that get a real opportunity here to be able to stand out? We're going to break all that down tomorrow before practice kicks off. And then after practice, once I get back to the hotel, or if I can stream from the Jack Hammond Sports Complex, we'll see if they'll let me do that. Like I have been able to from the Superdome. Then we'll just do one right after practice or soon after practice. So I appreciate y'all, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day to all you everydayers out there. And as always, I appreciate you for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media. At Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.